While you're finding your seats, I'm going to introduce our next and final speaker, Dr. Lisa Golombek. And before I tell you a little about her, I would like to say that she was one of the first PhD students that Oleg Grabar had here. And all of his successive generations of students knew about her before they ever met her because she was the shining example. And we were always reminded that if we could be like Lisa Golombek, then we would be all right. Now, Lisa received her BA from Barnard, so she has her New York connection, in 1962, and her MA and PhD in 1968 from the University of Michigan at Ann Arbor. In history of art, but specializing in Islamic art. For many years, she served as the curator of the Islamic art department at the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and also taught as a professor at the University of Toronto. And so in these two institutions, she's now a curator emerita and a professor emerita. She has traveled widely in the Islamic world and has specialized in the arts of Iran. Her publications cover a wide range of fields, including architecture and including several books, but one that is used again and again for anyone studying Iranian or Central Asian architecture of the 15th century, which she wrote with Donald Wilbur on the architecture of Iran and Turan. She's written on gardens, urban history, painting, ceramics. Tamerlane's Tableware is another famous book, and she's been doing a great deal of work on the Safavids in Iran, and calligraphy. Her focus has mostly been on Timurid and Safavid art, and at the moment, her collaborative study of Persian pottery, influenced by the global trade in Chinese blue and white porcelain, is currently in press and due to appear, I hope, very soon, maybe the end of the year or the beginning of next year. It's remarkable how much field work Dr. Golombek has been able to do in Iran, and we really look forward to seeing this latest contribution to the study of Persian art and Persian pottery. So today, her talk is In Quest of Paradise, Accommodating Death in Islam. And with no further ado, I'd like to welcome Lisa Golombek.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Sheila, for giving me this opportunity to honor one of the important figures in my early development, Charles Wilkinson, who was very helpful to me when I was a graduate student studying Nishapur pottery. And I'd like to thank my colleagues who spoke so eloquently because they set the stage for what I hope won't be a great disappointment to you. If you were an archaeologist digging at a site of a medieval city in the Middle East, whether Egypt, Syria, Iraq, or Iran, and you hit upon what seems to be a cemetery, I'm afraid if you were trained in one of those earlier cultures, you would be most disappointed to learn not to expect to find any grave goods. According to Islamic law, burial takes place almost immediately. The body is ritually washed, dressed in a shroud, and lowered into a grave. As you see in this 13th century painting from an Arabic manuscript of a funeral where the deceased is shrouded in white and is being lowered into a grave. There is no coffin, there are no personal objects, no embalming, perhaps some perfume. And yet, probably 90% of what survives of Islamic architecture relates to the funereal, and much of that also, much of what of objects could also be related to that. What I'd like to explore here is the Muslim attitude toward death and the treatment of the deceased in relation to those artifacts that accompany these states. We're going to consider 3 types of things that were made to deal with the end of life: the shroud, the grave and its markers, and the mausoleum. As we look at how the Muslim view of matters relating to death is expressed through art and architecture, I do intend to bring forward all of the laws and traditions regarding I do not intend to bring forward all of the laws and traditions regarding proper burial practice, nor is it within my expertise to expound on the various Islamic philosophies about death and the afterlife. What I hope to do here is to use the testimony of these works of art and architecture to tell us what the actual practice was, and where possible, to give us an idea about what people were thinking. As a precaution against viewing the entire history of Muslim culture through a single lens, we can expect that attitudes and interpretations of Islamic law evolved over the centuries and in different ways across different geographic areas. We're going to begin usually with the Quran, what it says, and also with the Hadith, the traditions that followed, and use them as a sort of baseline. The Quran, as you probably most know, is the sacred book of Islam, the compilation of testimony believed to have been dictated to the Prophet Muhammad by the angel Gabriel in the early 7th century AD. The traditions, the Hadith in Arabic, are the commentaries by the Prophet's companions that arose within the 1st century after his death in 632 AD. Now, the Quran doesn't give directions on how to do everything, how to behave. So after the Prophet died, his companions shared their individual observations on how the Prophet had dealt with various situations. These were recorded, and they became the foundations of Islamic law. Mind you, there's a lot of diversity of opinion for each question, as each companion may have seen something different. So we'll look at some of these for insight into matters concerning death and burial. We must bear in mind, however, that since those early days of Islam, over the course of time, the dynamics changed. The center of power moved eastward to Baghdad in 750, closer to the cultural influence of Iran and Central Asia. Centers of learning grew and diversified. Within Islam, we see the evolving of Shiism and Sufism, mysticism. So as Islam moved further away from its birthplace in Arabia, local customs remained entrenched and influenced burial practice. For example, in Egypt, native converts might defy the Islamic prohibition against embalming. The Quran, as you see here an example of an early page, the Quran views death as inevitable, and it exhorts the Muslim to prepare for judgment by acting in accordance with its demands, charity and faith. For the good, resurrection is promised. For the bad, hell is ordained. Here are some of the things that the Quran says about death. How can you disbelieve in Allah, seeing that you were dead and He gave you life? Then He will give you death. Then again will bring you to life on the day of resurrection. And then unto Him you will return. Or another verse, this one appears commonly, everyone shall taste death. and only on the day of resurrection shall you be paid your wages in full. And whoever is removed away from the fire and admitted to paradise, he indeed is successful. The life of this world is only the enjoyment of deception. So the traditions following the prophet's death affirm this centrality of the resurrection in Muslim belief. They also add the notion that Muhammad, the prophet, will serve as intercessor. Let's now turn to the question of the shroud. Traditions relating those stories about an individual's death and burial emphasize the simplicity of the ritual, particularly with reference to the shroud, in Arabic kafan. The model for the shroud is that which was used for the prophet. According to one of the most famous recorders of hadith, the prophet's wife, Aisha, narrated, the prophet was shrouded in 3 pieces of cloth made of sahul, which is a type of cotton, and neither a shirt nor a turban were used. Another tradition speaks of a man who fell from a camel and broke his neck. Thereupon, Allah's apostle commanded them to bathe him with water mixed with the leaves of a lote tree, and to shroud him in 2 pieces of cloth, and not to apply perfume to him, keeping his head out of the shroud so that he would be raised on the day of resurrection pronouncing prayers. So we learn that at this time, that is the 8th century, the body was to be shrouded using very simple cloths, normally 3, but sometimes 2 or even a cloak. The garment used for the shroud was preferably old rather than newly made. The head was uncovered so that it could recite prayers on the day of resurrection. And even today, the shroud of a Muslim must consist of at least 3 simple cotton pieces of cloth, starting from the one closest to the body. There's the loincloth, front and back from navel to ankles. 2, a long shirt covers the body from shoulders to below the knees. Mecca, the body perpendicular to the Qibla, the direction of Mecca. And this orientation is reflected in the gravestones of any Muslim cemetery. Now let's consider the evidence we have for shrouds. Now, unfortunately, shrouds are textiles, and what happens to textiles when they're under the ground? They deteriorate, except in the case of Egypt, where there is a very dry soil, and there we have wonderful evidence for shrouds. In fact, fragments of the shrouds removed from the cemeteries in Cairo appear in museums all over the world. They represent materials which were produced in Egypt itself, but also other parts of the Islamic world which exported their textiles to Egypt. And here is an archival photograph from the 1930s in Cairo of a medieval exhumed body from which the shroud this doesn't seem to be working. Well, the laser pointer doesn't work. The shroud is being removed from the face of the corpse. So let's look at some of these Tiraz textiles. Let's try this. That's better. Most of these shrouds are a very specific type, known as the Tiraz textiles. These are relatively simple woven fabrics of linen or cotton or half silk. And they're embroidered or have tapestry woven inscriptions which run in bands. What do these inscriptions say? Now, since most of these textiles were made for the royal household, they give you the name of the ruler under whom they were made, and they invoke blessings on him. They often also tell us who the official was that was responsible for commissioning the textiles. And conveniently, they often give us the date and the place in Egypt or other parts of the Islamic world where they were made. Now, the word itself, tiraz, eventually came to mean embroidery, but it has really more to do with the fact that it is the protocol, blessings on the caliph, the ruler, and on his family, etc. How do they appear on garments? Showing you here this plaster sculpture in the Metropolitan Museum where this princely figure is wearing armbands with inscriptions on them. Now, many of these tiraz textiles are very beautiful, with their colorful silk embroidery or tapestry woven bands. Just a word about Arabic script. What you see in these examples of the tiraz textiles is a form of Arabic known as Kufic, after the Muslim city that was founded in southern Iraq, Kufa, possibly where the script was developed. It's characterized by a reduction of the Arabic alphabet, which reads from right to left, from 28 to 4 or 5 basic forms. And in this way, as the basic forms repeat themselves over a line, a rhythm is produced. So, for example, in this upper example, these vertical staffs, most of which come from real letters, but some of them are really unnecessarily extended, it creates a beautiful rhythm across this line of script, which starts from here and reads to the end. That script is relatively unadorned. The one here on the lower left has decoration in the background while the letters march on below, and with their stems rising up and curving in these sort of swan's necks. This one here on the right comes from a very monumental script, possibly used for furnishings. And then they can also be quite colorful, quite decorative. By the 11th century, we get bands of animals between the two lines of scripts with rabbits and birds and other things. This one here is an ikat dyed textile with gold painted inscription and very elaborate characters in which the letters are braided together. And on the left, a later one from the 12th century where the lines of script now drop that Kufic form and they use a cursive script. All of these textiles I'm showing you come from a funerary context. This context is something one should pay more attention to, as Jochen Sokoli has shown in his doctoral thesis and articles. I mentioned before that these tiraz textiles were found wrapped around bodies. And in the controlled excavations of the French archaeologist Roland Pierre Gairaud, we actually can keep track of what was going on. So he discovered in Cairo, in the large cemetery, several large buildings with rooms and garden courtyards. These were intended to be mausoleums, as bodies were buried in vaulted underground chambers. Here's one of his finds, and it's interesting for several reasons. First, as Sokoli remarks, the decorative band with the name of the ruler is placed, this is the head, across the mouth of the corpse. For the dynasty that was then ruling in Egypt, known as the Fatimids, who were Shiites, this was particularly significant because the name of their ruler, the Fatimid Caliph, who was believed to be a descendant of the Prophet, was particularly revered. And when he was invoked through these tiraz textiles, was thought that he could intercede for the deceased. And that's why they were so important to use as shrouds. The caliph represented a link in the chain of transmitters by which divine truth and knowledge was handed down to the living imam, the caliphs. So just as the traditions had introduced the idea that the prophet could intercede for the soul of the deceased, so the Fatimid Caliph could intercede for the spirit of this deceased. But there's a problem with this. In one of the burials uncovered at Fustat, the tiraz band that covers the face of the deceased, and here's an enlargement of it, is an embroidered cotton dating not to the Fatimid period, but to an earlier period, to 932 AD. And thus, it invokes blessings not on the Fatimid Caliph, but on one of his rivals, his earlier rivals, the Abbasid Caliph, who was a Sunni ruling in Baghdad, because that textile would have been left over from the previous dynasty. But that didn't seem to be a problem for whoever chose this as their shroud. Just showing you here a full-length example of a very similar textile in the Royal Ontario Museum of approximately the same date. How was it possible for this Fatimid person, this person from the royal family, to use a tiraz invoking the name of the earlier caliph? I think probably because it contained blessings of any sort, and that would have served as an intermediary. It would be as if, because it's placed over the deceased's mouth, it would be as if he were himself reciting the prayers. The second interesting point is that to the excavator Gairo, this early shroud, this Abbasid shroud, appeared to be new, that it didn't show a great deal of use. It was only about 50 years old. So how did it arrive in its current position? How did the later generation get it? Possibly the new invaders of Cairo, the new owners of Cairo, inherited the treasury of clothing that their predecessors held. Evidently, old antique articles of clothing with pedigree were highly valued. So looking back at what the traditions tell us about shrouds, to what extent do these burials adhere to those traditions, going back now to what we talked about earlier? Well, in their simplicity, they do fulfill the dictates of the traditions. They're usually white, sometimes blue, or sometimes green. Many of them seem to have been turbans, because they have fringes. Some of them perhaps robes. And a case in point would be this very interesting textile, very large tiraz textile, which is preserved beautifully because during the Crusades, probably, it ended up in Apt Cathedral in France. And there it was used to drape the statue of Saint Anne on her feast day. However, when it was discovered in the 19th century what these inscriptions said, that they were invoked Allah and blessings on the caliph, the Fatimid Caliph, that tradition was discontinued. So what is this textile? Now, there's been suggestions that it was a robe, we call an abaya, an abba, and that it would have been draped from a back around the front, and the shoulders would be sewn, and there would be slits made for the arms in case you wanted to put your arms through. However, this textile shows no signs of any sewing and no slits. So how do we understand this? Well, perhaps it was actually made as a shroud before it went to France. And in fact, there is a tradition that suggests it's a good idea to dress as properly as possible for the day of resurrection. Just to quote that, a companion of the prophet said, "When the time of death came, he called for new clothes and put them on." This is the companion of the prophet. He then said, "I heard the apostle of Allah say, 'A deceased will be raised in the clothes in which he died.'" So indeed, the ruler and other dignitaries might find it appropriate to commission shrouds that were new, or these would be appropriate gifts to give to people that they owed a favor to or to honor them. And in fact, there's one story about a woman who worked in the palace, and the caliph gave her shrouds to bury her brother. Now, some of the shrouds that were discovered in the cemeteries in Cairo are very rich, decorated with threads that are wrapped in gold. So you might ask, how much were people willing to pay for a shroud? We have some information about costs from the texts. For example, let's use as a baseline the salary of a distinguished professor around 1000 AD, which came to about 6,000 dinars a year. That was a good salary. Well, a fine linen turban might cost you 500 dinars. But now consider this. The shrouds used for the mother of the Fatimid Caliph al-Aziz were valued at 10,000 dinars. This is one individual. That is almost twice what that favored professor earned in a year. Okay, let's now turn to the question of the grave. I'm going to discuss the situation of the graves and grave markers. From my experience in traveling around the Islamic world, there seems to be an enormous variation in the construction of graves. The most common, of course, was the open pit, which is filled with earth after burial. And this form corresponds to what the traditions dictate. The traditions stress the principle of the leveling of the grave. That is, death makes all men equal. Nothing should really be built on top. But in many parts of the Islamic world, the body was not just put into a hole and covered up. A vault of some kind, either sealed after burial or approachable by the family and pilgrims, was constructed. Sometimes these stand in cemeteries with staircases going down, as in the tombs which Cairo found in Cairo. Others of these were found in crypts that are part of mausoleums. But we'll come back to that question when we deal with mausoleums. So basic burial is a hole in the ground, but if it's more elaborate, you might have some kind of a housing. What about coffins? They did construct wood coffins that were used to hold the body until burial. However, the body was then transported to the grave and then removed and lowered into it. So tradition is not to have a coffin. Nevertheless, the excavations in Fustat do show that those burials within mausoleums generally are within coffins. So I guess you could take it either way. The more monumental form of underground burial in a vault would be in a crypt. And here's an example of a mausoleum which has a crypt that stands up a bit above the ground and then goes down below. And what you see here are the vaults over that crypt. Now, such mausoleums generally have grave markers on the floor of the building, but they have duplicates also below in the crypt, and then the body is underneath that. Now, what about grave markers? For the average Muslim, a simple grave marker with the name and date of death is sufficient. Here are two examples. They vary widely. The one on the right is quite early. The one on the left from Turkey is quite late. And these generally have scripts. They're verses from the Quran. They give the name and date of death of the deceased. But then they can also be more elaborate. They can be sort of rectangular solids, like the one on top, with very elaborate carved arabesque decoration, or the one below on the right, which is all ceramic tile built up in a kind of pyramidal form. Or we can look at the cenotaphs in the Taj Mahal. The one on the image on the upper left is in the actual floor of the ground floor of the building. The two below, the ones below here, are in the crypt. Now, in none of these instances where you have this kind of box-like form does the body reside in the box. It is always empty. This type of grave marker is often referred to as a sanduk, or a box. And we have a lovely example of one of these from a Shiite shrine in Iran in the Royal Ontario Museum. These cultic markers are often a tour de force of the woodcarver's art. Now, the inscriptions on this box don't contain a date, but the style of the Kufic script, which runs all around everywhere, suggests 11th, 12th century Iran. The inscriptions do mention the 12 Shiite imams. So in addition to the Quranic inscriptions here, we also have some hadith. And I've put this one up for those of you who do like to read Arabic. This is the transliteration of the first line and the second and the third. Just to translate it for you in case you don't read the Arabic. This world is a sowing ground for the next, and the grave is the storage chest of good works. And the word used for storage chest is sanduk. So this is a kind of a play on words where the verse is talking about this very chest, this box, which you are looking at now. So before moving on to the subject of the mausoleums, I'd like to summarize what we've learned so far about Muslim attitude toward the artifacts associated with death. The convention seems to be that burial in the ground should be marked in some fashion. The markers varied greatly. Inscriptions seem to relate more to the ultimate destiny of the person buried there than to those visiting them. They are a form of intercession on behalf of the deceased. The verses from the Quran, the blessings, and then if you came and read those inscriptions, if you were a visitor, this would assist, in the intercession for the deceased soul. We've been talking about those artifacts that are primarily for the use, so to say, of the deceased. We now move to the housing of the deceased. Going back to those excavations in Egypt, those excavators found many mausoleums that were built during the Abbasid period which were then rebuilt by the Fatimids. They turned out to be really more like villas than what one would think of as a mausoleum. They had multiple rooms with several graves in them, and they had small courtyards with little gardens and pools, fancy pools. Clearly, these buildings were intended for use by the family, for family visits, particularly by the women for whom it was acceptable to come there and socialize. Cemeteries in the medieval Islamic world, in contrast to ours, were centers of great activity, prayer, study, and simply socializing. Now, central to this behavior was the notion that not only was the soul of the deceased to benefit from the prayers of the living, the tomb, particularly if it was a holy person, the tomb itself exuded grace, barakah, blessings on the visitor, the pilgrim. The subject of the mausoleum in Islam, and there are many, is very vast, and there are many ways one could approach it. I could simply show you a large variety of very beautiful buildings extending from India to North Africa. However, I'd like to instead explore the mausoleum as a concept. Why were they built? Who used them and how? Let's now go back to Islamic tradition. What does tradition say about the mausoleum? It's worth looking at this question again, even though it's been discussed in the literature many times, because usually it's just dismissed as saying, well, the traditions forbid the creating of mausoleums, but it was a prohibition that was irresistible. And that's it. And then they just go on with the history of the mausoleum. But I think the question is far from clear. And there seem to be both a negative, which I'll present, and a positive argument for these mausoleums. On the negative side, the traditions, the hadith, report that when the prophet was told that two women had seen a church in Ethiopia that had pictures, the prophet said, "Those people are such that if a pious man amongst them died, they build a place of worship over his grave, and they paint these pictures in it. Those people will be Allah's worst creatures on the day of resurrection." So, as we know that there was a proscription against painting pictures of images that might be worshipped. So, because this building in Ethiopia had images, it implicated the building of the mausoleum itself. So that's one negative point. Another negative point was, let's consider how the prophet himself was buried. He was laid to rest inside his house, which was attached to his mosque in Medina. The tomb was then surrounded by an enclosure, a wall, so that it would not be worshipped. It would not be an object of worship. The wall actually, though, had 5 walls rather than 4 because they wanted to make sure that it wasn't confused with the Kaaba, which was to be the center of worship and not to have it confused with the Kaaba, the tomb confused with the Kaaba. So initially, there was no dome, nothing erected over the tomb of the prophet, with just this fence around it. However, in the 12th century, a dome was built there. So how do we get from no dome to mausoleum, to dome? Tradition reports that the prophet viewed death as an equalizer, a leveler, and that consequently no man's grave was to be raised above another. And looking at early Muslim mausoleums in Egypt, the esteemed scholar Cresswell felt that the canopy tomb, which was open on all 4 sides to the wind, the rain, and the dust, was as close as one could get to fulfilling this tradition that nothing was to be built over the tomb, nothing was to obscure it from the elements. Now, let's then turn to the positive evidence. In the Quran itself, there is a surah, the surah of the people of the cave, which tells the story of the 7 sleepers of Ephesus, a story which is known from Christian hagiography. Story goes something like this. During the Roman persecution of Christians, there were 7 young men who refused to recant their beliefs in Christianity, and so they fled to a cave. The Roman governor, who was supposed to persecute them, sealed up the cave, and the men went to sleep. Some 300 years later, the cave was unsealed, and these 7 sleepers were found still asleep, alive. When they awoke, they praised God. The Quran views them as holy men and cites the discussions that circulated when the discovery was made. And here's what the Quran then says. Thus did we make their case known to the people, that they might know that the promise of Allah is true, that there can be no doubt about the hour of judgment. Behold, they dispute among themselves as to their affair, and some say, construct a building over them. Their Lord knows best about them. Those who prevailed over this affair said, let us surely build a place of worship over them. And this has been taken in discussions of Islamic tradition to be an acceptance of the mausoleum as an appropriate gesture. There are a whole series of mausoleums which were built for holy men, and one of them is for Najmuddin Kubra, who was the leader of the Sufis, the Sufi order, the Kubrawiya, who has a wonderful story to tell in his writings in the 14th century. He and his followers were walking around in a cemetery when they noticed a dog who was wandering about, stopping to genuflect at the holiest of tombs. And he remarked in amazement about this, and he said to his followers, we must build him a mausoleum. So there's no clear answer as to how the mausoleum became not only acceptable across the Islamic world, but de rigueur, especially for religious leaders. And while there was no precedent for mausoleums in the Sasanian Eastern world, there was in the Roman and antique worlds. Why it then became so acceptable might explain that perhaps because the idea of resurrection and paradise, which came with Islam, were part of the basic belief. Then there is another way of looking at this. This is a mausoleum in Bahara from about the same period as those Fatimid mausoleums in Cairo, one of the masterpieces of Islamic architecture. But what's interesting about it is that, like some of the early Egyptian tombs, it's open on all 4 sides to the elements. So possibly this was built in that way in order to satisfy that original tradition. But there's another theory that this particular form, this 4-arch structure, was copied or inspired by the Sasanian fire temple, which one would have seen dozens of examples of in the countryside in Iran, dating from just before Islam. This is where the sacred fire was guarded and as venerated by the Zoroastrians. Another theory was that this particular form, which you see in the Bahara Mausoleum, was really a garden pavilion, and as such would be appropriate as representing the future Garden of Paradise. But these canopy tombs became the way to go in Islamic mausoleum history. Here's a very large one. They got very big. This one in Turkmenistan at Merv. This one in Iran, in Sultaniya. These are all very large mausoleums for princes, and they were part of complexes which included palaces, schools, and other buildings. I think when you get to this point, we're no longer dealing with the kind of vanitas that inspired those inscriptions on our earlier sunduks or on our other mausoleums, but rather with vanity. Then when we come to the shrines of holy persons, we have an alternative to the mausoleum. This one on the right is in Afghanistan, in Herat, the shrine of Abdullah Ansari, who we know did not want to have a mausoleum built over his tomb. So instead, in the 15th century, he actually died in the 11th century. He was a kind of patron saint of Herat. In the 15th century, an enclosure was built around this tomb, which didn't violate the prescription against building a mausoleum or a dome, but actually did enhance the holy place. And I like to think of this great arch behind it as, in a sense, picking up the vibes of barakah or grace from the tomb and broadcasting it into the countryside. On the left is a page from a manuscript in the Met, the Attar manuscript, from a little bit later than this monument, but it shows a burial in a cemetery. Another common way is to build a platform with a fence around it, this enclosure, like the one of the prophet, but the burial is underneath the platform. So these are ways you could avoid building a mausoleum and yet pay homage, pay honor to the person buried there. Then if we come, however, to the Shiite shrines, those were Sufi shrines. The Shiite shrines are quite a different matter, and here you really had an option to build a dome because the Shiite imams were, in a sense, kings. They were the rightful descendants of the prophet. So this is the famous shrine of the Imam Riza, the 8th Imam, in Meshed. And it started out with a very small building, a tomb. He actually died in 818. By the 12th century, a small mausoleum was built, richly decorated. But then in the 15th century, a great mosque was built behind it, many other structures attaching the tomb to the mosque. And then after it just expanded like a spider web, and you can hardly see the tomb. They finally, of course, built a great big dome over it. And then, of course, there are the combinations of tomb and religious institution. This one's in Cairo, where the tomb of the founder is combined with a religious institution. And that, you get a double benefit there because the deceased benefits from the prayers that are going on in the mosque or the seminary that's attached to it. And his descendants also benefit because the endowments of this institution benefit the descendants. They receive salaries and stipends from it. But the endowment also finances the operation of the school or the hospital or whatever it is. So we have then combinations here of school and tomb, which is a very interesting way of accommodating social services. You could also add a mausoleum to an existing school or hospital or whatever and get the same benefits. And in this example, we have the tomb of Tamerlane, of Timur, which was added around the courtyard of the madrasa and khanqa of his grandson, who was supposed to be his heir apparent, but he died before him. But Timur himself is buried here as well. So there were two large buildings on either side of the courtyard, the monumental entrance portal, and then in here, covering the graves and the crypt, is the actual tomb of Tamerlane. And I like to draw this parallel. Here's a page from a manuscript of a Shahnameh of a somewhat later period, not much later, which I think is based on the Gur-Amir, the entrance portal, the courtyard, and then the mausoleum with its dome and the biers, or the tombs of the descendants of Faramurs here who's visiting them. And then finally, we come to this idea of the garden, and like to pick that up as the last aspect of the mausoleum. Mausoleums were often, most always decorated with paradisial imagery. This case comes from the Taj Mahal, where we have beautiful floral decoration sculpted in stone. Or we have, in this example, from Herat, Gazargah, mosaic faience tile, where we have arabesque decoration. These sorts of vegetable decorations are very appropriate for evoking the idea of paradise. But probably, and just further along that line, we have a new type of building that comes into existence in the 15th century, which is based on a floor plan, which has 8 spaces around it. It's a central dome with corner domes and avans on the axes, giving us 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 spaces. And this was correlated with the Persian idea of the 8 heavens, the Hasht Behesht. So this Hasht Behesht plan became very popular for mausoleums as well as for garden pavilions. And on the lower right here is the tomb, the great Mughal tomb of Humayun in Delhi. Probably the best example is the Taj Mahal itself in Agra, which was built for the wife of Shah Jahan by Shah Jahan around 1636. And it has one of these Hasht Behesht plans, this garden pavilion, suggesting the 8 paradises around the central dome. And I've showed you earlier the cenotaph of Shah Jahan's wife, Mumtaz Mahal, and his cenotaph lies beside hers. But probably the best example is the garden itself in the Taj Mahal complex. The Mughals were the first to take this paradisial pavilion, this Hasht Behesht, and place it at the head of a formal garden, making literal what had always been figurative in Islamic thought. This is the garden as it had evolved under the Timurids in the 15th century. It was divided into 4 parts by canals of water that intersected in a pool in the center. These became the four rivers of paradise. And then, of course, there were gardens filling all of those quarters, the four-part garden, the Chahar Bagh, as it's known in Persian. So what better gift to his wife could Shah Jahan make than recreating the heavenly paradise on earth? And it is there for all of us to enjoy as a kind of preview of the world to come. And just to show you that the meaning has not been lost, I leave you with this wonderful poster advertising the Taj Mahal as a place that you might like to, I don't know, dwell in, but at least visit. Thank you.